Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the second part in this video series in regards to planning for learning. So addressing broad theme of planning for learning, but within that broad theme, essentially looking at many of the topics, the initial topics within our unit of work here. So for this video, I'm going to be explicitly drawing upon one of the readings for topic 4, Roy Killen's Effective Teaching Strategies, chapter 2, Foundations for Effective Teaching and Learning. So if you have not yet, you need to pause this video and go ahead and read that chapter and highlight key sections for yourself that stand out to you. And if you like, you can have your chapter that in the library, you can actually PDF copy the whole chapter and print it out if you want, or do it on your PC. Have that in front of you as I kind of go through it. So I'm just going to be adding my own thoughts and insights and ideas and elaborations of some of the fundamental aspects that stood out to me that I think is really important in Killen's text. And what Killen's text does really well is it synthesizes much of the really great research that has been done in regards to thinking about planning for learning. How do you as a new teacher approach this notion of, well, I've got to plan some learning experiences for a group of learners. So it does that really well. It synthesizes the research. And I think also what it does is that it positions you as a pre-service teacher with a really strong foundation into this idea of considering the learner first, or learner-centered pedagogy. And just as a little preamble before I get into some of this material, is that there is certainly some criticism or some thinkers and some politicians and education ministers. Simon Birmingham's one example, Kevin Donnelly's another example. Kevin Donnelly's not in government, he's an education thinker, I guess, advisor, but they have leveled a lot of criticism into things like learning styles or learner-centered instruction from teachers, that it waters down education, that students don't learn as a result, that this is the reason why we've been falling standards in the NAPLAN and other tests like the PISA. And unfortunately, there's a little kernel of merit in some of that criticism, and that kernel of merit is that really this notion of the theory-practice divide, that although there's a great amount of fantastic work that's been done in learner-centered pedagogy, or Killen goes into a lot of that, and constructivist styles of learning, unfortunately in schools what happens is this great research that's been done for a long time, many decades. What happens is it gets watered down in schools into kind of a really simplified way to put a lot of this research into practice. So you see this in learning styles. There's visual learners, there's kinesthetic learners, there's auditory learners. That is a very watered down approach to essentially multiple intelligences and constructivist styles of learning. And it's been very popularized in many schools. And in fact, I certainly practiced that when I was a teacher and thinking about my learners that way. And it's very overly simplistic, and there isn't a lot of necessarily empirical evidence to support the notion that there are such things as learning styles, or students learn in different ways. That doesn't negate a learner-centered approach to pedagogy, which is what I'm going to elaborate here in this chapter, and what Killen does very well. So it's just an important preamble here that although there is criticism in this area, I think the criticisms are actually not based on a really solid understanding about what constructivist pedagogy means. So I think you need to, from my point of view, I think you need to accept that this makes sense, and I'll go into that, and that as a new teacher, these form, some of these ideas that Killen's presenting to you form the pillars, the foundational pillars for you to plan really great, meaningful learning experiences. And I've seen this firsthand. Teachers who take this approach, when they plan learning experiences, when they do it in schools, when I've supervised them in schools and I've watched them, I've read their lesson plan, these are fantastic, dynamic, engaging learning experiences that any teenager would want to get involved with. So, Killen's chapter begins, and I think this is an important point to make, that when on page 23, when he talks about the notion of how good teaching has changed, or notions of good teaching has changed over the years, where he says that many of the reviews that have been done these reviews contain many suggestions about how teachers can help learners develop knowledge or skills, but they all conclude no single teaching strategy is effective all the time for all learners. So this gets down to the idea that I was making in the last video about this narrowly defined set of skills, that teachers who only have a few tools in their tool belt that they can use, they wear out very quickly, and that if they get a different context, so a different group of learners come in, so from year to year, you get different individuals, different makeup, a different class. And if that teacher thought the same strategies worked for last year and they try to do it for the new group of learners, things just aren't working, things just aren't gelling. This notion that they're a different group of learners, so they need different kinds of strategies, and constantly learning about and evolving your repertoire of strategies is so important, and Killen reinforces this idea. So I want to move down on page 24, the middle of page 24, some of these key, these key pillars, these key foundations that you need to be working from as you start to think about particularly assessment 1, because assessment 1 requires you to plan a learning experience, a full learning experience, and based on a repertoire of understanding about strategies, about modalities of thinking, about questioning frameworks, all those kinds of your instructional map, and thinking about building this great learning experience. You've got to be coming to terms with the fact that the research really has found, when they talk to students, when they talk to teachers, when they researchers sit in classrooms and they watch what goes on, this stuff is not just based on nothing. It's based on observation. It's based on the evidence that these researchers have found in schools, in classroom, what works. So Killen sort of cites the work of Brophy and Good from the mid-1980s, but still this stuff is so intuitive, it really makes sense. And they emphasize the following points: that in general, academic learning is influenced by the amount of time that students spend engaged in appropriate academic activities. So this, it's one of these statements that sounds simple, but it's really actually quite complex, that the more time students spend on a task, the more understanding they'll develop about that content. And this is quite hard to do, and a lot of new teachers approach their lesson plans, I find across the board, pre-service teachers, you actually, if there is any rule of thumb in regards to thinking about time management, which it's very sort of academic before you start getting some experience in classrooms, give yourself more time than you think you need, because there are so many other competing activities and procedures and things to do in the classroom that eat up time. So just thinking about beginning your lesson, for example, gaining students' attention, sometimes that can take minutes, and in a lesson plan you may just have a statement as the first thing, gain students' attention, and then you move to the content. Well, gaining their attention takes time, and students come in late, and there might be other competing things going on, and you're managing students' behavior, etc., until you're ready to actually begin talking about the lesson, the content, the instructions for what they're going to do that day. Other things like research-based tasks inevitably take much more time than you think that they will. I've seen on pre-service teacher lesson plans, 10 minutes to, find the information on the website. Sometimes students can take a long time reading, thinking about, well, what's important here. They're talking to their mates, and in a group scenario especially. So have lots of activities in your lesson plan, but for me, always having more stuff is better, because you can take that stuff that you've got and you can put it into the next lesson plan. And so really think about giving your students more time than you think that they need. And the second point there, learning is easier for students when their teachers carefully structure new information. So again, it sounds simple, but it's not. This is very hard to do. Carefully structuring the lesson plan so that students learn the new information that they're being presented with. So structure there is the important word. So learning happens when teachers structure that information. So it's important that you need to be thinking about, well, what is that structure? How do I make that clear to students? And again, I've seen plenty of pre-service teachers walk into classrooms and they just start talking and talking, and there is no structure. Just presenting content, they may be writing stuff on the board, or they're just moving around the room and they're explaining things, and I just see the students and they switch off because there is no careful structuring. There's no thinking about, well, what is happening in my learner's head in response to all the stuff that I'm saying or doing on the board. And this is learner-centered pedagogy. This is thinking about, your starting point needs to be, well, how are they going to think about the information that I'm presenting them? What are they going to do with that information? The next point Killen makes here is teachers should help students to relate new information to what they already know. Again, really important, and again, hard to do as well, that you need to be thinking about, well, if I'm going to relate some new information to what they already know, the question is, well, what do they know? And that's something that you need to be thinking carefully about. What are you going to do to ensure that you learn about your learners? What do they know about this bit of content already? What information have they come to the classroom with that they've learned in previous years, in previous lessons, in their daily lives? And also, sometimes students think that they know something, but actually it's wrong. Science teachers need to think very carefully about misconceptions in science, that a student may have a misconception about how the world works. And part of your job is dispelling that misconception and making sure that they actually then fully understand about what is going on here. But it's not just science. In lots of subjects, students come thinking that they know about how the world works, but actually it doesn't work that way. And also the important thing there is thinking about that if you're teaching, at the moment you're considering one single discrete lesson plan, 60-minute lesson, but you've got to think about different levels or layers in that planning, that you essentially, what you do is you start to chain the learning experiences together. So if you say that there is 4 learning experiences or lessons in your subject in a week, so here is your first one that you're planning, but then what's going to happen next and what's going to happen after that, and where does this lesson, so these 4 chain together, and then the weeks start to chain together in a content area or a topic. So 8 weeks, for example. So where does your one single lesson experience or lesson plan fit within the broader chain, the broader collection of learning experiences over the whole topic? So that's about relating understanding as you start to work these levels of planning in. So the last point that Killen makes is teachers should monitor learner performance and provide corrective feedback. So this is assessment techniques. So how are students going to know that they've learned something unless you are monitoring how they perform and then provide that constructive feedback? So that's again another set of strategies or techniques that you must learn in order to then respond. So your teaching then becomes learner-centered because you're responding to what students know, what they still need to know. Because if you just keep barreling along without thinking about, well, what's going on in for my learners, what can they do, what still can't they do, then by the end of the content, there will be lots of holes unless you've monitored and provided feedback throughout. So that's so important. Assessment is daily. It's tied into the teaching that you're doing every day, not just the test at the end of the block of work. At the bottom of page 24, again, Killen reinforces this notion that where he says, contemporary views of effective teaching are much more learner-centered than they were in the past. So again, there are many techniques and strategies that have been replaced for the better, I think. It doesn't mean that they don't work in certain contexts, in particularly some cultural contexts. So if we look to Southeast Asia, their cultural context may fit a lot of that drill and instruction method, but our cultural context doesn't fit those strategies anymore. It's sort of, lamenting that in the past these worked, so why don't we still do them? But as soon as you spend some time with teenagers, you'll quickly realize that those techniques just don't work anymore, and that we do need to be thinking about the learner first. And when we do this well, when we do it based in the research and in a theoretically rich way, it does work well. And I've seen it work fantastically well in classrooms in all sorts of contexts, low socioeconomic schools, very high-performing schools, private schools. This stuff always will work if it's done effectively. So moving into the middle of page 25 here, Killen makes the statement which I think is really just so intuitive. And I'm sure if you consider the ways in which you learn best, this just makes sense. He says, it is now generally accepted that most people learn best through personally meaningful experiences that enable them to connect new knowledge to what they already believe or understand. I mean, isn't that just the case? When you learn that, you want to learn stuff that is personally meaningful to you. And yes, in school, not everything is personally meaningful, but that's the work of teaching, that if you can make this kind of meaningful for students and connect what you're teaching them to what they already know, that's when the stuff starts to come alive. It's no longer dry and two-dimensional. It's a teacher's job, I think, today is making learning three-dimensional. That doesn't mean it needs to be fun all the time. I actually think that learning can be fun. It doesn't have to be fun all the time. But for me, I think it needs to be three-dimensional. It needs to be alive. It needs to be something that you can look at and see and work with and do things with, rather than, worksheets all the time, textbooks all the time, two-dimensional, flat, boring, learning, drill, practice. I do this on the board, you write it in your books. I mean, to me, that's never fun. I mean, so, some students may achieve through that. But I think when learning is personally meaningful, that's where the fun is. Rather than starting from that, that comes as a result, sort of a byproduct, as it were, of making it more engaging, more dynamic, more three-dimensional. So moving down to page 26, in the middle of page 26, again, this Killen is articulating, again, these pillars, these foundational pillars that you need to start building for yourself as you start making great learning experiences. And he talks about that, thinking about how do you build really deep understanding in learners. It's some of these kind of stuff, again, that just makes so much sense. I think if you yourself enjoy learning, you sort of go, well, tick, 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 this is true. It requires teachers to do the following: transform the raw content into something that is easy to learn. Okay, so taking that raw content and making something learnable. Okay, so there is a doing word there. When something is learnable, the students are doing something as a result. So you're taking the content rather than just telling them about it. Well, what are they doing in response? You can, as a history teacher, I could, talk ad nauseum about World War II, but then it's just information. The information is not learnable until students start doing something with it. Also, teachers who create a physical and emotional environment that is conducive to learning. Now, this is all learners, whether it's the young learners or senior school learners, but I think when you start to consider your first planning experiences, my recommendation, my advice is go for the younger groups. Go for students that are in year 7, 8, ideally, because what you need to do is you sort of need to think a little bit more dynamically about some of these aspects. So physical and emotional environment. So what is the physical environment? What are the chairs like? How they set up and arranged with the desks? What's on the walls? What information is being presented to them visually, auditory, sights, sounds? What's going on in terms of that learning environment? How are you making that positive for those learners? I think for the younger students, you just need to think about this a bit more explicitly, and then it helps you later on with the older learners. Killen as well says structure learning tasks that will lead students to an understanding of the content by allowing their brains to process information effectively. So structure there is again that important word, that you're structuring the learning, you're helping students move along from one bit of that structure to the next bit of the structure, and you're making sure that they understand the parts and the whole. And this notion of, and Killen talks about later in the chapter, this idea of, well, what are brains doing? How are brains learning? And I think neuroscience and this notion of the learning brain, and there's tons of stuff that you can go if you just Google the learning brain or education. There's a lot of stuff about how brains work and how they function that we have discovered more recently, particularly in the last decade or so, that really reinforces all the neuroscience, just reinforces all the stuff about learning-centered pedagogy and constructivist learning that has evolved, for decades. That the science now is catching up with what a lot of these social researchers have said, and yes, psychologists as well, but certainly social researchers, when they go into classrooms and they observe and their findings around learner-centered pedagogy, the brain imaging about learning is saying that, yes, this is how brains learn. Brains learn through experience. They learn through doing. There is this concept of neuroplasticity, that the brain is always changeable. There's always has an ability to adapt and to work in different ways. And, this notion of even left-right brain dominance has been thrown out by neuroscience more recently, that that the brain is active in all sorts of areas. There's very little dominance, left or right, and has nothing really to do with your personality, that's for sure. So again, engage with this research, at least find out some of the more interesting aspects and try and work these things into your own understanding about learning. Again, Killen talks about motivate the learners to engage with the learning task. Motivate. This is not easy. It's not easy to motivate a group of 14-year-olds sometimes, but you need to work at it. You need to work hard at it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you always need to be articulating, okay, everyone, I want you to be really engaged with this, and you must think positively. Again, that stuff, motivation is a byproduct of the work that you're doing in terms of how you're structuring the learning, how you're presenting the content. The students should be motivated as a result if you're doing your job really well. If they're not, and you're doing everything that you can, you shouldn't feel bad. That's on them, and often with pre-service teachers, I talk to them about, any teaching is a two-way street. It needs to go both ways. And as long as you're doing everything that you can as a teacher and you're practicing in the best way possible your techniques and strategies, the learners have to come to the party. The learners have to engage with you to ensure that that the stuff actually gets traction. And some students won't. Some students won't always want to engage with you in that way, and sometimes there's not a lot that you can do about it. For the last point on page 26, monitor students' learning and respond appropriately to students' changing needs. So that's that notion of assessment that I talked about before. So I want you as well, if you're following along on this chapter, to look at the bottom part of page 28 as well, figure 2.1, a model of teacher knowledge, and just make sure that you get a sense of what that particular diagram is communicating to you, these concentric circles and how they are overlapping, because this is really, Killen's sense of, well, this is what I'm presenting here in this chapter about how, as a new teacher, you need to be thinking about the knowledge that I'm building. And as a new teacher, all of these circles you need to be filling in all the time, and you're filling it in now, doing the theoretical coursework. And I can tell you that as soon as you go out on your prac and you spend that time in schools, the knowledge about learning and the knowledge about teaching get really filled in. You get a ton of experience through just observation, watching and doing, and then the trial and error. Knowledge about content is always kind of being worked on, but the knowledge about learning and teaching, that comes through practice, it comes through implementation. But both of those need to be at least partially, filled in, as it were, before you go on prac. That you need to have some of these skills, this repertoire at your disposal, that you can at least work from this foundation. So important. So make sure you get a sense of that diagram. And I just want to as well, with this Killen stuff towards the latter half of the chapter, just make sure that you are engaging with this material, because there is a lot of really good stuff there. But I'm going to zoom down to page 38 just to finish this video, because we're getting almost to half an hour, where Killen on page 38 talks about quality learning. And again, this is just to reinforce this message once more about how intuitive this approach, how much this just makes sense. And again, if you're at all interested in learning and what that means, and you must be as a teacher, because you yourself, I hope, are someone who enjoys learning, it's sort of tired metaphor of a lifelong learner. But Killen sort of talks about these points that he emphasizes through not just through this chapter, but the whole book. So he says that number one, learning results in changes in understanding, and he's italicized the word changes there, because as teachers, that's what we're thinking about. How do I change understanding or skill here? How do I develop a student? That's what teaching is. Teaching is focused on that middle word there. Change. Some sort of change needs to occur. And so he says changes in understanding as a direct result of learners' experiences. There's that word experience. So important. And they're thinking about those experiences. So that actually has a word. It's called metacognition. It's sort of thinking about thinking. And that's a really important, again, another thing to engage with. And if you look up, if you Google metacognition in learning or in schools education, there's a whole lot of stuff about that. Teaching students how to think about their own learning. It's a reflective process. They go, well, what have I already learned, and where are the gaps, and how do I fill in those gaps? That sort of leads directly into assessments. And then thirdly, these changes in understanding enable learners to change their behavior. So, metacognition skills allow changes in behavior. So what happens is students go, well, I did this process, and at the end I got this result, I've learned this much. Now how do I, and it may only be here, there, or thinking about a particular outcome in an assessment, when they look at that outcome, how do I then change my behavior to respond to that outcome? So if I want to do better next time, and that constant improvement. So as teachers, we need to be thinking about, well, what are my learners doing? And the more experience you get, what happens is when you're a pre-service teacher, you're thinking so much about yourself. What am I going to say? What am I going to do? How am I going to do this? How am I going to manage students? What are the strategies I'm going to use? And as you get more experience, as you go down the spectrum, your teaching responds more and more to think your first port of call is, no, what are my learners doing? Not what I am doing. What are my learners doing, or what have they done? Then what can I do in response to that? And that's really Killen's focus there on those 3 points. And again, there's a list of points here on page 38, 39 around, where he synthesized this, the research from Brad from 98 about human learning. And I think just read those points, because some of these are so critical. And again, they are summarizing, for me, this sense of having a really strong foundation that you need to internalize as you move forward and you start to create these great plans. And there's tons of stuff here, that people learn where it's meaningful, that it's developmental. They learn more when they accept challenging and achievable goals. Learning occurs through social interaction. Learning doesn't just occur when we're on our own. It can occur, but so much of really deep learning occurs when we engage with others, and that's very true for young people and for teenagers. People need feedback for their learning. They learn more effectively if they understand how to use strategies. Again, that's this notion of metacognition. Positive emotional climate strengthens learning. Of course it does. The environment influences learning, so teachers need to think about the physical, social, psychological aspects. Learning is a cyclical process. Students are more likely to become engaged if it piques their interest or imagination. Imagination is so important. Get students to use their imagination. Creativity is so important in all aspects of school content, not just the arts. Imagination, creativity, this fuels students and gets them thinking and problem solving and coming up with dynamic answers to complex issues and problems. Active learning practices have a more significant impact on student performance than any other variable. Okay? Active learning practices. And that's why when I talk about lesson plans, I talk about learning experiences. An experience is something that is active. It is not something that is static. It is not something that is dry and two-dimensional. When you experience something, all parts of your brain and body are engaged. And the body is also so important. Our smell, our touch, the ways in which our bodies engage with other bodies in the classroom, and how that works within learning in our brains. It's active, it's doing, it's happening. We're making something work. That's when learning occurs. It doesn't occur when we just read a textbook and we answer the questions at the back of the textbook. It can, but it's much harder to make learning and deep learning happen if we think about deep learning as being something that is meaningful that students can take with them for the rest of their lives, you hope. And lastly, in this last point on this page, where I'm going to finish here, creating a non-threatening classroom environment where mistakes are welcomed as learning opportunities, reduce tensions and increases the opportunity for learning. So this notion of, again, a positive learning environment where the learner is accepted for who they are and where they're at and their skills, abilities, all of that. That is what is so key today, that students young people want to be accepted, and they don't want to fear asking questions. They want to fear failure. And I think when schools engender a fear of failure, of which fortunately the standardized testing does, it's incredibly detrimental to learning. And the best classrooms that I've seen over the years are those where positive learning in all sorts of different kinds of ways, from different kinds of students, no matter what their background, no matter what their ability level, when that's encouraged, there's really great things happening. And that, A, the teachers loving what they're doing, and B, the students are engaged and they're working. It doesn't mean everything is perfect all the time, and teaching is always up and down, and it's always a process of improvement there and making things work better, but that things are heading in the right direction. Things aren't toxic, things are positive. That's so critical. So I'm going to end things there. It's getting up to 35 minutes there. So again, I hope this has been useful for you. The next video in this series next week, I'll be thinking about and preparing for your prac, your placement, and some of the advice that I can give around that. So I hope that's useful to you. And as well, I'll be posting on the Facebook group a little poll around the first Collaborate session, so we can actually interact with each other online as well. So thanks again for engaging, and good luck with the studies.